But simplicity is not so simple to attain. Steve Jobs figured out that you have to work hard to get your thinking clean to make it simple. The Arabs have an expression for trenchant prose: no skill to understand it, mastery to write it. Heuristics are simplified rules of thumb that make things simple and easy to implement. But their main advantage is that their user knows that they are not perfect, just expedient, and is therefore less fooled by their powers. They become dangerous when we forget that. This is from the prologue of Taleb's book Anti-Fragile, and it is the source book where I learned the word heuristic and began to understand it better. And we're talking about the idea of heuristics today, as well as this idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect when it comes to skill development and using CQB as the the test bed, the example. Let's just use that as a case. That being the case, let's jump right into it. Before we do, this show is currently supported by you folks, the listeners. It is brought about by the time you spend with us, as well as the the purchases you make from our store at redactedllc.com. We are running a pre-order right now on our subdued shirts, and as well as a new version, which is the inverted version. So that being the case, if you want to head over there and help out the show, get part of the pre-order parts, those who participate in the pre-order are automatically entered into a giveaway. We're going to be giving away at least one, if not two, Tour knives, and they are a company who I have enjoyed working with in the past. They make a great product. That being said, you may be familiar with the Dunning-Kruger effect, and to those who are watching on YouTube, you'll see that I have brought one up. This one is probably brought to you by somebody like Wikipedia, good old times, right? But the term Dunning-Kruger effect comes into the social discourse somewhat regularly now, and sometimes it's used in a somewhat derogatory way to accuse somebody of having more confidence than competence in the subject that they're talking about. And while we may use the idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect to try to explain away the confidence that other people have, I think the true value of it, especially when we're looking at skill sets like CQB and other gun culture related activities, is actually introspection. Now, something that goes, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the idea of a heuristic in reference to the Dunning-Kruger effect as a model using CQB as the subject. This has come up into discussion lately a number of times, particularly with Kyle from Core Vision on Dirty Civilians channel. They've been doing really, really well, and I like to see their success, as well as conversations from Orion Training Group and a few other instructors. It also tends to find its way in conversation in any way, shape, or form related to gun culture, but we don't always use the same words. I want to use the model of the Dunning-Kruger effect as a way of considering how we think about our capabilities and our objectives while learning, or while learning a skill like CQB, because it certainly is a combination of a skill that must be practiced and learned over time. Now, with the graph on the screen of the Dunning-Kruger effect has an X and Y axis, and I know, the X axis being the horizontal one is the one of competence, or also known as skill. And then the other one, the up-down or Y axis, is confidence, low to high. The higher the peak, the more confidence, but the further, in the screen, the further right you go, the more it's supposed to denote more skill. And you see this common pattern in people when they are learning a skill like CQB, because while they're learning fundamentals, they will gain more and more confidence until they seem to hit a peak where, in the Dunning-Kruger effect, people refer to it as Mount Stupid. I think that's a little derogatory. It also isn't very productive. It's just sort of pointing at it and going, ha, ha, ha. But then soon after, even though their skill continues to develop, they drop down into what the Dunning-Kruger effect graph in front of us calls the Valley of Despair. Now, I've produced my own names for these things, and some of it comes across as a bit of a testimony to, I think, the effectiveness of this model as a heuristic. Remember when we were talking about what Taleb was warning about, is that One of the dangers of a heuristic is when we forget that it is more like a simplified rule of thumb than a hard in stone law that governs reality. But I wanted to bring it up because, or I wanted to bring it up today because not only is it a subject of conversation that seems to be coming up a little bit more lately, but as we are seeing the proliferation of firearms related skill sets across a broader swath of the American population, this is an opportunity where we can consider how we think about that skill development, and apply a form of introspection to ourselves. So instead of it being referred to as the beginning where we know nothing, I want to break this Dunning-Kruger wave into 4 sections. The first section the first section is referred to as the ascent of fundamentals. This is before we reach the first peak. And the ascent of fundamentals begins with building a naive and unskilled individual's basic abilities in regards to the skill. Each valid method of instruction develops the student in execution of basic maneuvers, principles, and rules. Foundations take time to build, but repeated practice is necessary to cement lessons learned. In this first ascent, the ascent of fundamentals, we are watching rules and methods get established in the student. In the idea of CQB, we start seeing things like clearing your corners, keep maintaining security, approaching the doorway, keeping your muzzle or your rifle aligned towards where threats may be presented, and so forth. The student is starting to learn things like, well, we don't do these things. You don't, if you're the first person approaching a doorway, if you're the number one man, you never really want to take your eyes off of that doorway. That is, let somebody else handle the administrative tasks that you're going to accomplish before you enter, like prepping a banger or moving through the room. This is where you see it as a fundamental, where that first guy, that number one guy, never wants to lose focus on what he's aiming at. He never wants to lose perspective that his job is to maintain absolute security on that doorway. But these are just fundamental skills. As a student starts, or a student or a learner starts approaching the end of this phase, this first phase, this ascent of fundamentals, they one of the key elements is that they should be able to perform those fundamentals regularly with repeatability. They should be able to at least execute those skills. You know, a person's ending the fundamentals phase, although we will say you're always going to be relearning and engaging and practicing fundamentals. When a student is approaching the end of this phase, they need to be capable of performing basic maneuvers with repeatability. They also start to be able to identify when rules are being broken, like when they enter a room and they don't clear their first corner, or when they enter a room as the number 2 man and they go the same way as the number 1 man. These are very simplified examples. But the idea then is the end of the ascent of fundamentals transitions into section 2, which is the plateau of dogma. I don't think that I think the Dunning-Kruger effect model as presented is oftentimes, or is, as we've stated earlier, too oftentimes used as a tool by which to ascertain other people's skill and relevance to their confidence, or maybe discredit them, but rather its true value should be an introspection of one's own abilities. So section 2, or the second top, this is that first peak that we see. If you Google the Dunning-Kruger effect model or graph in if you do a Google search of that, you're going to find it oftentimes referred to as peak of Mount Stupid. But what I would refer to it as is the plateau of dogma. This is where the ability to perform fundamentals in sequence continues to improve in the student, because mind you, despite the issue of their confidence, they generally are continuing to learn new skills, but more complicated. And at this time, they start being able to smoothen out more complicated maneuvers and communicate these fundamentals in a partially an instructor way, or maybe as a colleague, or maybe as a more practiced student. This individual who's kind of existing on the plateau of dogma is able to identify when others break the rules, maybe even when they break the rules themselves. But what you start to see, basically kind of like a martial arts esque, or before MMA, martial arts esque, a commitment to a specific school of thought. You start seeing, as Kyle from Core Vision was talking about, a little bit more of the always and nevers and very little of the sometimes in description of skill sets and abilities. So this second section, the plateau of dogma, though, the individual tends to gain a lot more confidence in their skill set as they see the success of clean execution and continued practice. Their view of the subject very commonly, though, becomes dogmatic, and we're going to sidebar on specifically what dogmatic means here in a second. But their view becomes dogmatic as they are incapable of distinguishing between a rule that is broken and a skill set from a different subject, a different school that's used in conjunction with their own. So let's go into the word dogma. Dogma is a word that oftentimes comes up in both philosophy and theology. And a dogma, the word dogmatics, comes from, if I'm not mistaken, it comes from the Latin word meaning for. It comes from the Latin meaning essentially right thinking, or the right way of things. Dogmatic. I should have brought this up again before I got started, but dogma. What a dogma is it's sort of a rule set. A dogma is the way things should be, the way things should be done. And why we tend to criticize dogma in our world in the 21st century, because it wasn't always that case. For a while, the term dogma was used with a little bit more highly. The term dogma tends to think about, it tends to be tied with the word orthodoxy. And orthodoxy is from the Greek, and orthodoxy means right thinking, right doctrine, right written rules, right codex, right, essentially right thinking. It's oftentimes contrasted against orthopraxy, which is right, proper, right, correct action. Orthodox, which is where we oftentimes see it tied with the word dogma, is right thinking, and orthopraxy is um, right practice. Orthodoxy being right doctrine, right theology, right theory, right belief. Orthopraxy being right action. Back to the concept of skill, and back to the Dunning-Kruger effect. So the issue that you have with dogma, especially in skill sets like CQB, is that not only do we live in such a dynamic world where the environment could change at any given time, but the issue that really hard cemented rules tends to bring is that unless you're omniscient, unless you know every possible outcome, which none of us do because we're human, unless you know every possible outcome, you really can't achieve perfect dogma. Unless if that were possible, if somehow in the world one of us could obtain perfect, objective, omniscient knowledge, then we would be able to write the correct dogma for something like CQB, because CQB also includes a high stakes game. It's not like we're just playing foosball here. If anybody knows what I mean, foosball was a relic of the 90s, and I'm sure it'll come back with a vengeance sometime. But this dogma phase, remember what we're talking about dogma is when we're talking about this peak of dogma, this plateau of dogma, is that a person is very skilled. As this person is skilled, they are capable of identifying things that break the dogma, but they're not able to understand why or how. Maybe that's a good example. Maybe another example of it is they're narrowly focused on a certain rule set because they have been taught to do it that way, or because that is the culmination of their fundamentals. But what happens is that this phase typically ends after a precipitating event or series of events breaks the paradigm of their dogma. Although confidence begins to drop, their skill, though, will continue to improve. So if we're looking at the Dunning-Kruger effect graph here, and we've got that horizontal x-axis of competence, starting with knowing nothing and ending in guru in this example, what we're going to see, or what we would expect to see, is we would expect to see declining confidence but continued development in competence, declining confidence but improving skill. And this third section is what I would refer to as the descent of Renaissance, or Renaissance, if you wanted to even get fancy. And as the subject or the student begins to descend from their dogma, they begin to consider exemptions to their established rules and principles. This usually takes time, genuine effort, practice, learning, and this is where you see an example of this would be the peak of dogma, especially in anything like CQB, would be something like, we always do a strong wall. We always use points of domination. We always clear deliberately. We always clear dynamically. We always punch the center. We always run the rabbit. We always do these things. Or you might see it as another way. I never learn from SEALs, or I never do anything that these people do. Or another example would be, that group doesn't know how to blank. Well, I mean, that's a little bit generic, but perhaps more importantly, what what the difference between the plateau of dogma looks like versus the descent into Renaissance looks like is when somebody is in that dogmatic phase, they are doing the thing like the Rangers do it, or like the SEALs do it, or like the Delta Force guys do it, or like the manual does it. Once they get out of that mentality, they start understanding, usually as their skill develops, how it's not so much about rules. For example, in the world of CQB, where there really aren't rules. I mean, there are maybe rules of engagement, but there aren't rules in the same way that there are principles. And principles are things that guide your decision making process. A principle would be like, you never want to, or you never, ooh, there you go, close to dogma. A principle would be like, it is always in your advantage to give the opponent no opportunity to know when or how you're entering the room. So if you flag yourself, if the barrel enters the room, well, you're going to identify the person who's inside the room. The target is going to be able to identify not only that you're entering, but how you're going to enter the room, and they will have an instinctual advantage over you. So the principle would be surprise. We don't want to give away our position. Another principle would be like security. You never want to have everybody in the team, or you don't want to have, if all the people in the team, here I am doing it again, always and never, if all the people of the team are laser focused on one problem, they lose awareness of everything else that's going on in the room or in the building, and that sets them up for jeopardy. That jeopardizes their security. And so what you're starting to see, these principles, is they're not so much like rule sets, like always clear your corner. They're starting to see things like principles as things that they want to be able to accomplish better and add more tools to the toolbox. A renewed interest in fundamentals is common in this third phase, this descent into Renaissance. A renewed interest of fundamentals changes from simply improving importance and articulating the skill set to separating between a heuristic and a principle. A heuristic is a simplified rule of thumb, as presented by Nassim Taleb. Articulation is steadily exchanged for comprehension. This is an important distinction. There is a difference between being able to articulate a subject and being able to comprehend it and its application. Comprehension looks like not only understanding how it works and understanding the principles, but the ability to choose between multiple maneuvers and skill sets to solve a problem. And the more they comprehend it, the better they will be, the individual will be at solving complicated problems or even simple problems through a list of skills that they have, and being able to choose the right one at the right time to accomplish the task. In this phase, the priority is the development of skill sets primarily, as well as supporting skill sets. So this is where you might see somebody who's learning how to do CQB also start learning how to consider things like breaching, but also there's quite a bit more to it. But you also you really the goal that we're really looking for in this Renaissance phase is that the dogma of rule sets is exchanged for the mastery of skill sets in their application. I'm going to restate that. The primary identifier of the third phase, that is the descent into Renaissance, is that dogma of rule sets is finally exchanged for the mastery of skill sets and their application. This is where you start understanding not only that you have sometimes, always, and never, but that sometimes is something that you can articulate, understand, comprehend, and use, live with, and live within successfully. I'm going to restate that within the realm of CQB, and I'll use an example. Right now, I've seen this topic come up a number of times of never letting your stock come out of your shoulder. That already should send off the red flag of it being a dogmatic approach. Never allow your stock to come out of your shoulder. That would work in an environment where every single element of that would work in an environment where every single area that you're maneuvering through happens to be considerably wider than the length of your entire carbine. And there's no obstacles in the way. It can be equivalent. It can be sometimes the equivalent of like a flat range scar that comes from that happens in the shoot house. It's not meant to be over the top, but this idea that you never take your stock out of your shoulder is quite simply stuck in a dogmatic phase where the one time where you're in an environment or in a situation where you would need to that would give you a better advantage, you don't do it, and then that compromises you, and now we're in a bad position. Another example would be never use high port, or never use what do you call it? This high port or high ready is another example of it. Or there's a lot of focus placed on like different rifle positions, whether you do like high port, with the barrels pointed up, or you're doing low ready. And the challenge between those two is the short answer is you should be able to do both. If you live in a world where you can only do one, if you can only do high ready or they call it high port, or you can only do you're only capable of performing in a low ready position, then you're very solidly in the plateau of dogma. If not, you're still even working on the fundamentals. It doesn't mean that you can't be skilled in other ways, but what I'm saying is this idea that you would never ever use sort of a high ready position ever at all. You can't see you can't understand any example, or you don't have any idea of when that might be used, is an identifier that you're in that dogmatic phase. And I can use I'll use that as an example. I'll pull up an example on that later. But the high ready, high port phase is oftentimes, I guess, in military culture seen as like a competition between Army and Navy standards, or it's like a Navy SEAL thing versus an Army Ranger thing versus a Delta Force thing. And really that is if you're thinking about it that way, we kind of need to step away from realizing that like the tribes were all kind of in this together. The whole tribes thing of like, oh, well, Navy SEALs do it, so it's dumb. It's like, we got to kind of pull back on that one, man. I think you can do better. But maybe an example of it was while I was in Ranger Battalion, we did almost everything from the low ready. That was just kind of the way of it. We did a whole, and this was just at the time, but actually here's a more important example would be, I remember very distinctly in Ranger Battalion that we went through these phases of dogma when it came to strong walling a room versus doing a points of domination. And you would have usually some sort of change of command come in, and we would talk about it, and they would talk. We'd go to the shoot house, we'd do our training, and the command, whether it was platoon sergeant or platoon leader, whether it was officer or enlisted, would basically come out and say something like, okay, from now on, we're always going to do X. We're always going to strong wall, or we're always going to use points of domination. And that would work so long as we were only doing shoot house simplified rooms, like shoot house, hyper simplified rooms with minimal to no furniture, where we was like, okay, a corner fed room, or on a whiteboard, even better or worse. We would be doing this thing on a whiteboard where we'd, like show how people would move, or we'd show how we'd clear, or we'd even practice clearing a room, and we would always strong wall every room. But what would inevitably happen when we were strong walling every room is we would encounter a room where there was significant amount of blind spots, dead zones, red zones, whatever you want to call it, where somebody in the room had to move in order to clear out that area, whether it was a couch, a cabinet, an L-shaped room, or whatever. And so suddenly this we will always strong wall mentality could not meet up against the real world. But however, what do you say about points of domination? Well, I mean, here's the thing that would happen in points of domination is in the room and the rules of points of domination, the one man would, at this time, the dogma, when a different leadership came in, the dogma would be one man always takes two corners and the two man always takes one corner, which, if you're familiar with CQB, you know what I'm talking about. If not, don't worry about it. You'll get there eventually, or well, not even there eventually. This way of teaching might already be out of vogue. But the one man, so if in this dogma where we always did points of domination, and the one man always took 2 points of two corners, what he would inevitably have to do is he'd inevitably have to put himself into danger, walking in front of an open door or into around the L of an L-shaped room in order to accomplish his task. The dogma would dictate that he had to hit two corners. Now, if there were cadre up in the ceiling watching, or cadre up in the catwalk watching, usually they would use this time to berate the person who did what he was told, and it would get nowhere. The lesson would be lost. There would just be frustration abound because the guy would be more focused on doing what he's told than learning the environment. However, he was prepped by his leadership to always do it this way. Therefore, the leadership, blaming him for his foolishness, also set him up for failure. This is a common problem that you see when dogma takes over leadership. Now, especially leadership on the platoon and squad level. But now, what are we talking about on the team level, or in the? We're going to bring it back to the Dunning-Kruger effect within introspection. Dogma is oftentimes focused on producing the perfect skill set, the Bruce Lee-like punch for the environment that they're in. And we like to quote this idea of Bruce Lee is I would rather do one punch 1,000 times than a thousand different punches, one time. True. That works when you're developing a series of fundamentals. But you also have to be able to apply those fundamentals in different environments. The environment that we are fighting in, the CQB world, is a complex and complicated, moving, dynamic environment with extreme moral hazards, physical hazards, as well as environmental concerns. And so the dogma may apply when learning a specific skill set, like drawing a pistol, using a red dot. Here's an example with a red dot, right? If I'm transitioning between targets, I never want to follow the dot. I want to look at my next target and then place the dot on the target. I don't want to be tracing the dot as I'm moving it across from target to target. And the reason for this is you tend to overcompensate, and then you tend to overshoot the target, and then you got to recompensate back in. For target transitions, this should make sense. And this is an example of a never being a dogmatic approach to a specific skill when applied, when understood as in that single mechanical maneuver. But if I apply that in other positions, remember a heuristic is not a hard and fast law, but a simplification. When I apply that heuristic in a shoot house scenario, what I'm recognizing is that the ability to, before I can shoot a target, I need to be able to identify it, and then I want to be able to engage it. And perhaps, if I'm skilled enough, I can even identify a target before my rifle gets there, and I want to train that into a habit so that I see my target, move my carbine, and align my sights and take my shot. So then this should raise the question, well, what's the fourth phase? And I've struggled with a couple of terms, but I think it should be referred to as the ascent of mature skill. The ascent of mature skill is that maturity. What I mean by maturity kind of harkens back to a conversation we had a number of episodes ago. I believe it was in the 30s. I think it was maybe episode 35 with a fellow by the name of Austin. Congratulations, by the way. For that focuses on the subject of maturity in skill development. So much of gun culture has come so far, especially in this subject, that we are able to look at what this maturity might actually be. And I have a single paragraph written here. When somebody is in the fourth phase, or the fourth section, which in the graph on the screen is referred to as the slope of enlightenment, or the up to the plateau of sustainability. But in my argument, it would be something like the ascent of mature skill. And I have this paragraph written. The subject continues to refine, polish, and execute maneuvers appropriate to the scenario. They refine micro components of each of the movements and tackle complex problems with some sense of order. The key feature is the ability to understand a rule or heuristic as well as when to break it so that the objective can be accomplished in the maximally effective way. This is what the goal should be when we're looking at skills like CQB. The goal is baked into the cake. Competence in regards to skill is then also able to articulate and understand objectives, goals, and directions and align their comprehensive set of skill sets into accomplishing that task. It has both the is and the ought for those who have been listening in regards to distinctions. And on top of that, it refines these sense of micro components of movement. So you start looking at some of the more finer details of footwork and some of the more finer details of movement, whether it's pieing or splitting decisions. And it recognizes that in something like strong walling and CQBing, well, the difference between the two is so minimal and easily adaptive, or dynamically and deliberately entering a room is a very, very fluid situation. I can be slowly pieing a door and then choose at some point in time during that pie to commit to the room, knowing that my team will come with me. This is what that ascent into mature skill looks like. It has left the dogma behind, the dogma of we only do it this way, we always do it this way. It's able to sort out the, let's just say, bad suggestions, because some people will try to use the advantage of people's breakdown of dogma to suggest skill sets that are antithetical to principles. I understand it. I don't want to get into detail. But what we do see, what the objective that we see in this fourth phase is that we see a combination of the further refinement of skill sets, as well as individual skills and maneuvers, as well as the identification of principles and objectives, and being able to orient our skill set towards those. So, in summary, and going back over this, in this idea of the Dunning-Kruger effect, as much as we like to use it as a method of evaluating other people's skills in relation to their confidence, its biggest advantage that we have in ideas and concepts like this, in heuristics like this, is that we can use them for reflection, introspection, self-development. You cannot develop without some desire of self-development involved. The first section is this ascent of fundamentals. You're learning the fundamental skills necessary to accomplish the task. For CQB, this might be clearing corners, the idea of strong walling versus points of domination. This is the principles of angles, the principles of are using angles to your advantage, of dynamic versus deliberate clearing. But usually this ascent of fundamentals, how to clear a hallway, how to clear a stairwell, how to clear a basement, how to do it under night vision, this tends to plateau at dogma. We always do it this way, we never do it that way. But dogma must give way, and it does with a descent in Renaissance. And in Renaissance, the kind of the renewal of the interest. In that Renaissance, we see we see where rules start to get broken and how to understand and evaluate how and when to break those rules. This valley of despair, as it's listed in the Dunning-Kruger model, but in this one, this descent of Renaissance really does address the challenges to dogmatism, and then, but it doesn't just open the door for whatever goes. It does not open the door for anything goes. It still keeps some semblance of order, and in many ways, it is defined. It is defined by the ability. Um, it is defined by the ability to maintain some semblance of order when they're tackling complex problems. But that is most clearly defined in the end goal. And the end goal is this ascent of mature skill, where the subject continues to refine, polish, and execute maneuvers appropriate to the scenario. They refine microcomponents of each movements, tackle complex problems with some sense of order, and the key feature is the ability to understand a rule or heuristic and when or how to break it, so that the objective can be accomplished with maximum effectiveness. That being the case, I'd like to hear what you think about the Dunning-Kruger effect and how it applies to subjects within gun culture or gun culture as a whole. Perhaps we would have a conversation about how this comes across in policy and philosophy when it comes to how we think about violence. This is where you can pop up the kind of old school meme of takes one philosophy course, thinks he understands the universe joke. Please don't be that guy. But that being the case, I want to hear what you think about it. So if you want to leave comments down below, we'd love to have a discussion. You can also reach out to us on Instagram. That's a great place to have a conversation. We're building a backside in a private area so that we can have member conversations as well as exclusive content available to you. And we're going to be able to make that available soon. If you just want to outright support the channel, you can head over to redactedculture.locals.com, where we will be posting some material as we go. That being the case, I hope that you've enjoyed this conversation and that it serves as a framework by which you can have conversations with your pals, your friends, your people, your comrades, well, that's a weird word, your neighbors, the people who you are in concert with, that we are in this together. Remember, this is our world, right? We are members of it. We live here and we have some responsibility to it. So one of those responsibilities in gun culture is, though we may be accused of being in some form of gaslighted way responsible for the atrocities of other people, remember that if you pursue what is right and true and good, that should be reflected in your actions, not in just the accusations of what people will say, because remember, some people will hate you because you are good. But that being the case, look forward to hearing from you. Look forward to see more from you in the near future. We're going to be putting out some. We're going to keep rolling through this year, this glorious year of 2023, and see what it brings up. That being the case, keep your habits sharp and your powder dry, and we will talk to you soon.